So we're about to start. Gentle reminder for those of you that need interpretation to French or to English, this is going to be bilingual. Better if you get headsets from just in front of the door, if everybody is equipped. I think we're going to start. Welcome to all of you. My name is Aziza Akmouche. I'm heading the division at the OECD that works on cities, urban policies, and sustainable development. And I'll have the pleasure to be your moderator today for this hour and 15 session devoted to the topic of regulation. I'd like to say a few words just to set the scene, but at this stage, I guess you've heard a lot in this forum to provide the rationale for this conversation on regulation and insights we will get from different types of stakeholders aligned around the table today. We have ministries represented, we have subnational governments represented, city network represented, and we'll have a specific second panel in a while, in a few minutes, devoted to stakeholders. All this to illustrate this shared responsibility for this decarbonization and resilience agenda in the building sector. And you've heard probably in the opening, but also in a number of sessions, the wake-up call and the evidence that underpins this shared responsibility. Buildings account for 40% of energy-related CO2 emissions. We've heard a lot on the very co-benefits that come with the building decarbonization agenda, whether it's in terms of job creation, over 30 jobs per every $1 million invested in the Americas, whether it's about poverty alleviation and energy poverty in particular that has been correlated in a number of countries to energy efficiency measures, whether it's about public health expenditures that are saved up to 190 billion euros only in Europe every year. And this shared responsibility, you'll see when we get into the who does what and how, is also calling for a mix of measures that are either the typical stick that we associate to the regulation agenda, but also the carrot and the incentives that can also come from better regulation. So really thrilled to be with you today and to moderate this panel. What I would like to offer is that we first hear a very short keynote from my colleague Takeshi Miyamori, who is the architect of OECD's work on decarbonizing buildings in cities and regions. He's just, with Jisoo and the rest of his team, conducted in collaboration with the French government a massive survey across almost 30 countries to look at the strategies that are in place to decarbonize buildings and draw some of the main takeaways. So Takeshi will be sharing specific messages related to regulation, but not only, just to set the scene. And then we'll have two different panels. And I'll introduce our distinguished speakers when they're about to take the floor. You'll see also a slide on the screen that will stay in the background with their respective names. We have, as I said, two ministers and vice ministers with us from Japan and from Côte d'Ivoire, and then we have the state of Sonora in Mexico represented, and C40 as city government network. Once we spend a good half an hour, so they will have each 2 questions. They were invited to stick to 3-4 minutes max. I'll try to be firm on the time so that we can take some Q&As with you, and then we'll move to the second panel using exactly the same format. So with no further ado, Takeshi, if you are ready, and with big thanks for your work and insights you will share, you have the floor to introduce in 4 or 5 minutes the main takeaways from that OECD survey.
Thank you, Aziza. Hello, everyone. My name is Takeshi Miyamori, and I'm leading a program called Decarbonizing Buildings in Cities and Regions. So my team is conducting a global survey on buildings and climate, which is supported by French government. And thanks to 28 countries, including Côte d'Ivoire and Japan, So we have a lot to share with you today, but I will concentrate on 4 key findings. So you can find the details in this QR code, which we will provide a policy highlight and 28 country profiles, which was launched yesterday. So this is a structure of a survey. So this structure was developed with French government, Global ABC, UNEP, and UN Habitat, and PIV. So let's deep dive into the regulation. So first key finding is the challenges in regulatory measures. For new buildings, affordability, the cost comes first. So expanding the target for the regulation, such as embodied carbon and rooftop PVs, are essential for the next stage. For existing buildings, developing the method and limit value comes first. Economic burden, as well as get the political buy-in, are critical for existing buildings. So second key findings is that countries are developing policy instruments step by step. For example, you can see in the below, whole life carbon policies. More than half of the responding countries said they have developed methodologies, while only 11% of the countries have limit value regulation for new buildings. So when you see the right side, so we have 89% of countries have mandatory energy efficiency code for new buildings. But only 80% of countries have the regulatory measures for existing buildings. So this is a real challenge. So third findings is that we do need to work together. So private partnership and the vertical coordinations. So what is critical to introduce a regulation and strengthening the standard is to prepare for the policy implementation and who do implement the policies. So it's the local government. And who design and construct the buildings is the private sectors. So national government cannot alone implement policies. So awareness raising, and also the capacity buildings, and also the trainings. So we cannot do this without, support from the private sectors and the subnational government. So to make things happen, we need a multi-level approach. The fourth key findings is that most countries will prioritize embodied carbon and circularity in the future. For the current policy focus, it's a heating and the renewable energy. So most countries are focusing now heating and renewable energy, which is crucial for the energy consumption, to reduce energy consumption. But in future, you can see the green part, embodied carbon and circularity of buildings comes the most. And what is also interesting is the cooling. So you can see the increase in the passive design for cooling. So countries such as France, UK, Italy, and Finland consider heating as a current focus. But in future, they said the priority will be cooling. So this is interesting because like the Asian countries, we have been tackling the cooling for decades. So to conclude, so countries are developing policies step by step. And we do have the examples, which is quite ambitious, like the existing building regulation or whole life carbon. So we can learn from them. So let's take a step forward and accelerate the local actions with multi-level approach. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Takeshi, and congratulations for the work. And if you've not seen your country on the map, or the list of 28 countries surveyed so far and wish to join, it's not too late. We are actually expanding the geographical scope, and the final report with the findings will be launched around the summer. So it's now my pleasure to kickstart the first panel, et je vais commencer en français pour inviter son Excellence, Monsieur le Ministre de la Construction, du Logement et de l'Urbanisme de la Côte d'Ivoire, Bruno Nabagné-Cognier, à partager l'expérience de la Côte d'Ivoire en matière de décarbonation des bâtiments. Ce premier panel porte véritablement sur le rôle des gouvernements, qu'ils soient locaux, régionaux ou nationaux. Et ce qui nous intéresserait, Monsieur le Ministre, c'est de savoir dans un premier temps les réformes, les étapes que vous avez suivies en Côte d'Ivoire pour introduire, pour élargir, pour renforcer les différents standards et les différentes régulations en matière de décarbonation. On vous écoute et merci pour votre présence.
Merci pour la question. Merci surtout de nous avoir associés à ce panel. J'en profite pour féliciter la France qui nous accueille pour son action, je peux dire, remarquable en matière climatique. Je pense qu'il y a beaucoup de jalons qui ont été posés, qui sont très positifs par rapport à l'évolution du traitement de la question par le monde. Vous imaginez que quand la question m'est posée en premier, il va être difficile de donner des exemples extrêmement précis et évolués parce que nous sommes un pays en voie de développement, nous sommes un pays en forte transition urbaine. La Côte d'Ivoire, il y a 60 ans, c'était 17% des personnes qui vivaient en ville. Aujourd'hui, c'est 52%. C'est une population qui a fortement cru et qui continue de croître très fortement, au-delà de la moyenne dans le monde. Tout cela mis ensemble crée évidemment une pression qui est forte au niveau des villes, au niveau de l'immobilier, au niveau des constructions. Donc, nous avons dû, au fur et à mesure, adapter nos textes et nos lois. C'est ce qui s'est passé jusqu'à très récemment, où nous avons rassemblé, en quelque sorte, tous les textes législatifs et réglementaires qui existaient dans ce qui s'appelle le Code de l'urbanisme et de la construction, d'un côté, et le Code de l'habitat et du cadre de vie, d'un autre côté. Donc ces deux codes sont aujourd'hui les documents essentiels qui récapitulent toutes les obligations en matière de construction. Et bien évidemment, comme ce sont des textes qui sont relativement récents, parce que c'est des textes pris en 2019 et en 2020, ce sont des textes qui font une certaine part aux préoccupations de protection climatique. Évidemment, nous ne serons pas à ce stade aussi offensifs que les pays européens. Parce que, comme je l'ai dit, nous sommes en transition vers les villes. Nous sommes, par exemple, à une première génération d'immeubles qui arrivent en fin de vie. Donc, c'est seulement maintenant que nos pays vont vraiment commencer à se préoccuper du démantèlement de ces immeubles, du retraitement des déchets de ces immeubles, de comment les remplacer, etc. Mais nous avons commencé par anticiper sur tout cela en regardant ce qui se passe dans les pays qui sont les plus avancés en la matière. Donc là, ce n'est pas très compliqué. Nous avons 3-4 aspects qui ont été fortement mis en avant. C'est par exemple l'aspect densification. Densification de l'habitat. Alors que nos pays avaient l'habitude d'un habitat très horizontal, nous poussons absolument à densifier l'habitat donc dans toute la ville d'Abidjan, qui aujourd'hui est une ville de 7 millions d'habitants. 7 millions d'habitants sur 30 millions de population totale. Vous voyez la pression que cela met sur une ville comme Abidjan qui ne peut pas faire sans cette densification. Donc nous densifions le plus que nous pouvons. La deuxième chose, c'est verdir le plus possible. Heureusement, nous sommes en milieu tropical, nous avons une belle nature et nous en profitons. Donc, dès à présent, pour créer le plus de parcs que nous pouvons, pour inciter à la création d'espaces verts et surtout à protéger l'existant. Je voudrais ici dire qu'Abidjan abrite aujourd'hui le deuxième parc urbain le plus étendu au monde, après celui de Rio. Donc, c'est le parc qui s'appelle le parc du Banco, avec 3400 hectares de forêt primaire en pleine ville. En pleine ville, donc, que nous nous efforçons bien évidemment de protéger. Nous avons d'autres aspects qui sont relativement marginaux, j'imagine, pour les pays européens, mais qui, chez nous, sont importants. C'est par exemple le traitement ou le retraitement des déchets, par exemple, qui viennent des réseaux d'assainissement avant leur rejet dans la nature. Ce n'était pas des choses faites par le passé, mais ce sont des préoccupations que nous prenons en compte dès à présent. Nous nous sommes dotés d'un ministère en charge de l'environnement, de l'écologie, donc qui existe depuis seulement quelques années et qui lui aussi contribue à la création d'un environnement qui soit plus propice pour tout ce qui concerne la protection de l'environnement. Je précise pour terminer que nous ne sommes pas du tout dans une logique de dire que nous ne sommes pas concernés. Nous sommes dans la même barque. Un trou dans la barque peut nous emporter tous. Donc aujourd'hui, bien que la préoccupation ne soit pas la première chez nous, parce que la préoccupation première, c'est d'abord satisfaire en quantité le besoin de logement. Satisfaire le besoin quantitatif de logement. C'est cela la priorité, mais bien évidemment, nous tenons compte des préoccupations environnementales et je peux vous assurer que beaucoup d'efforts est fait pour que nous soyons au même niveau d'exigence que la plupart des pays européens.
Merci beaucoup. Merci, Monsieur le Ministre, effectivement, pour rappeler, de rappeler que c'est aussi un enjeu pour les pays en développement, que les pressions qu'exerce l'urbanisation, la démographie et le changement climatique vous poussent aussi à accélérer les efforts en la matière et de rappeler aussi comment cela s'inscrit dans les priorités du pays et les inspirations que vous avez eues d'autres pays. Vous avez parlé de densification, de verdissement et de gestion des déchets, notamment. Je vais passer sans plus tarder, and I'll switch back to English. And now, delighted to introduce the Vice Minister from Japan, who will take the floor next, Mr. Shinichi Sakaki, Vice Minister for Land, Infrastructure and Hokkaido Development, known as MLIT in Japan. You have the floor, sir.
Thank you, Aziza, for your kind coordination. Our primary goal on building sector is to achieve the level of net zero energy for buildings on stock average by 2050. In line with this goal, we aim for all new buildings at net zero level by 2030. Therefore, we determined to expand the coverage of the mandatory energy efficiency standards to all new buildings next year, and upgrade it to the net zero level at least by 2030. While the building sector in Japan has an enormous impact on its economy, small and medium-sized business constitutes the large part of the sector. Their aging workforce has difficulty in installing new techniques such as the evaluation of building energy efficiency performance. Under these circumstances, there is serious concern that the introduction of regulatory measures could trigger confusions in the sector and have negative impacts on the national economy. To address this challenge, Japan has been striving to build enabling environment to achieve a certain level on energy performance through capacity building programs and raising awareness. With such effort, we have gradually introduced the mandatory standards for specific type and size of the building, which had achieved a certain level of performance. Therefore, Our mandatory standards were firstly introduced to large-scale, non-residential buildings, usually designed by large architect offices with sufficient skills in 2017. The standards for those buildings are to be upgraded in 2024 and 2030. The next subject of the standards was mid-scale non-residential buildings. The introduction for them was in 2021, and the upgrade will be in 2026 and 2030. Remaining small-scale non-residential and residential buildings will be under the standards in 2025, and they will be strengthened in 2030. In addition, when taking these steps, we will determine the details of the rules and release them to the public at least 2 years before their adoption, in order to enable architects to prepare to comply with the mandatory standard. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, please. Thank you very much, Vice Minister, for introducing these different steps, very clear targets by 2030. And I think you made a very good point about being mindful of the unintended consequences of regulation. And you did flag particular categories of stakeholders, SMEs being some of these, and therefore the needed capacity and the related investment that you've been making to mitigate some of these costs. So thank you very much. This takes us now to the subnational level, or let's say regional level, better than sub. I try to avoid this terminology of sub or higher or lower, I think, which is not always very appropriate, but very delighted to welcome Diana Durazo, who's the Executive Commissioner of Environment and Sustainable Development of the state of Sonora in Mexico, sharing boundary with the US. To give us a bit of a flavor of what's happening at the regional level, the second tier of administration in a federal country that can be of inspiration in this regulation pathway. You have the floor.
Merci beaucoup au gouvernement de France pour l'invitation. And as I said yesterday, that's as far as my English goes, my French goes, sorry. Well, I just want to give a little bit of reference for the state of Sonora. As our moderator just said, is we are just in a border with the U.S. And also, we as a state government can only do so much regarding the policies of buildings. So in my position as executive commissioner, I can only do that framework, that policies framework regarding climate change, adaptation, mitigation, and that also welcomes the building sector. That's why, and I found it very a personal challenge because I'm an environmental engineer and I have a master's degree in construction, so it's a really passionate topic for me. I found some allies in this work and in this route I'm trying to take to Sonora. One of those, it's the World Resource Institute that actually has a challenge called building efficiency. Those, the companies in Sonora that want to lower their costs in their electric bill, because of course we have sometimes even 55 degrees in the summer, so we are highly dependent in the cooling systems. These companies are working with us and World Resource Institute to mitigate or lower their bill, their electric bill, and that way they can contribute a little bit to the climate change in Sonora. Also, as our moderator just said, United States is just our neighbor, and we have a lot of influence with them. However, the materials that U.S. uses are not the best for Sonora. That's why sometimes we have to educate the people, the people that are right on the border, about the need of better materials to insulate their houses and make them more livable inside. I also would like to extend a congratulations to the work that in the state of Sonora and the capital Hermosillo is doing, because they are also working along with the state government in some framework, some type of guide that works towards the isolation of the houses to make to try and look for way to spend less electricity in the cooling of these places. And also, everything of our work is alienated with a lot of education. I've seen that some of my generation mostly is looking towards some houses that have more environmentally friendly materials, more environmentally friendly design. So I think that change is coming, that change is getting done, at least in my state. But we still have a long way to go. But I'm feeling hopeful that the new generations is trying to see and look for the good side of making a better efficient building, a better efficient housing. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Diana. You started saying we have very limited prerogatives at state level, and then all the examples you gave actually show the breadth of the prerogatives that you have. And I liked very much the example of youth and this intergenerational, also shared responsibility. Thank you very much. And we now move to Irene Skula, who's the Director of Energy and Buildings at C40. And speaking on behalf of your members and your city governments, the diversity of situations I guess you've come across when it comes to introducing, expanding, and strengthening regulation in this field. You have the floor, Irene.
Thank you very much. And thanks to the French government for inviting us in this great forum. So just I want to take a step back very quickly because I want to stress out the importance of regulations and standards for buildings. We know that these regulations and policies and standards show a clear path and signal. And in my bilaterals the past few days, but also in many sessions that I have been part to, I have been listening the private sector say that they need consistency for policymakers, that they need assurance of a long-term vision. Regulations and standards offer this possibility and can allow the private sector to invest and plan accordingly to comply with these regulations. C40 Cities is a very diverse group of 96 cities over the world, and many of our cities have committed to the Net Zero Carbon Buildings Accelerator and the Clean Construction Accelerator, which are high-level political commitments that our cities commit to develop net zero carbon building pathways for new and existing buildings that cover both operational and embodied emissions. These commitments also include pathway milestones, for example, by introducing building performance standards for existing buildings and a monitoring and evaluation system to track progress towards achieving the net zero carbon targets. And all these regulations and standards that the cities introduce are mandatory, becoming stringent over time. In parallel, they are also taking action and prioritize the better use, repurposing, and retrofitting of existing building assets so that we reduce embodied emissions to start with before taking any decision to construct new assets. And they also lead by example, as we feel there is no excuse for our cities not to decarbonize their own assets first, to show the vision and the leadership to inspire others. They also use their municipal procurement powers to introduce requirements for whole life carbon assessment, life cycle analysis, introduction of low carbon materials to provide a market for these materials to thrive. And by doing all that, their overall goal, of course, is to tackle the climate crisis by phasing out fossil fuels and increase renewable energy supply to cover buildings' needs, reduce embodied emissions, as I said, by utilizing existing assets and introducing low carbon materials, improve resilience and energy efficiency, but also, very importantly, help alleviate energy poverty and ensure a just transition for workers, but also for low income and vulnerable communities. And just very quickly, a few examples, because I know I have limitation in time. I will start with some Global South examples. I don't like this. Word emerging economies is something else that I hear and I very much like. We have two of our cities in Africa, Johannesburg and Ichugini, which were the first African cities to introduce a mandatory net zero carbon building code, which will enter into force in 2030 for all new buildings. And they did this by piloting this regulation in their own municipal buildings first, and they also did a series of training for officials to be able to check compliance with the codes. We also have, of course, examples in the US, Toronto, the Green Building Standard that sets cap on embodied emissions. Also in Japan, since we have here our honored members from Japan, building upon the national regulations that were just referenced, Tokyo has set up the cap and trade program that sets emission caps for large commercial buildings, and they have to manage to reduce in 10 years 35% of operational carbon emissions. We have also other examples like Boston and Chicago that have introduced ordinances for fossil fuel-free buildings and clean, affordable buildings. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Irene. Please do so. Really compelling to see the energy and the innovation that local governments are indeed deploying. They know better their building stock. They own a significant share sometimes of the buildings. They can leverage on public procurement. And actually that echoes a lot of the findings of the survey that Takeshi introduced also on that role across levels of government. And I was particularly intrigued by what you said about monitoring and evaluation and tracking progress at subnational level, because one of the takeaways actually is that a good 60% of countries surveys say they don't have the proper monitoring and evaluation framework at national level. I think this is interesting to see how this can be synchronized also across levels of government. Thank you very much. I'll go back maybe to all panelists with one final question, and I'll ask you please to be brief. And building on what Irene just put forward, very interested in knowing what you are doing to enable and engage the private sector in this conversation around building and regulation. Et je vais peut-être commencer par vous de nouveau, Monsieur le Ministre, si vous en êtes d'accord, pour la Côte d'Ivoire, un point de votre part concernant vos initiatives en la matière, participation du secteur privé dans ces questions de régulation et de décarbonation. En 2 minutes, si possible.
Bon, je vais essayer d'être court. Une chose est sûre, c'est que nous ne pouvons pas réussir une telle mission sans associer tous les acteurs. Le secteur privé est un acteur important dans nos pays, et donc le secteur privé est pleinement associé. Il est associé à travers les discussions qui se font, il est associé à travers les échanges que nous avons avant de prendre des textes réglementaires. Et la plupart des textes qui sont pris, justement, concernent ce secteur privé. Le secteur privé, pour faire simple, il y a 2 façons de l'associer. Il y a la façon qui consiste à le punir quand les choses ne sont pas faites comme il le faudrait. Et puis, il y a l'autre façon qui consiste à le récompenser quand les choses sont faites comme on le voudrait. Notre approche, en général, dans tous les textes qui ont été pris en Côte d'Ivoire, c'est plutôt une approche incitative. Une approche incitative au niveau de la fiscalité qui permet de récompenser tous ceux qui font des efforts et qui arrivent à réduire les émissions de carbone, par exemple, sur leurs bâtiments. Et tout à l'heure, j'en ai pas parlé de façon aussi détaillée, mais il est important quand même de souligner quelques textes qui ont été pris. C'est le Code de l'environnement, dont je parlais tout à l'heure, qui est piloté par le ministère en charge de l'environnement. C'est également une directive qui a été prise au niveau sous-régional, donc au niveau de l'UMOA, de l'Union monétaire des États d'Afrique de l'Ouest, qui fixe des mesures d'efficacité énergétique dans la construction, avec, bien entendu, des incitations pour cela, des incitations principalement fiscales, donc adressées à ce secteur privé. Il y a un autre texte qui a été pris qui détermine les conditions dans lesquelles certains matériaux de construction peuvent être mis en œuvre. C'est mon ministère qui, par exemple, assure le contrôle de l'application, de la bonne application de ces textes. Ça concerne également le secteur privé, puisque c'est lui qui importe ces matériaux, c'est lui qui les fabrique sur place, et pour l'essentiel, c'est lui qui les utilise. Donc, on ne peut pas le faire si on n'a pas une interaction au quotidien avec ce secteur privé. L'efficacité énergétique, j'en parlais tout à l'heure, et cela fait l'objet d'un contrôle. Un texte a été pris pour permettre qu'un contrôle soit périodiquement fait sur tous les immeubles qui sont fortement consommateurs d'énergie. C'est de plus en plus le cas dans certains quartiers de la ville d'Abidjan. Et nous avons adopté dernièrement ce qui s'appelle la politique nationale de la ville, qui permet de tracer les grandes lignes que nous souhaiterons voir suivies par l'évolution de nos villes. Et dans les 5 axes qui forment cette politique, il y a un axe qui concerne la promotion de villes vertes et résilientes et la prévention des risques. Et rien que dans cela, beaucoup d'aspects qui concernent le secteur privé sont également pris en compte. Donc là, j'ai vraiment essayé de ramasser, de faire vite. Je vous remercie.
Thank you very much, Minister. Thank you for the wealth of examples that relate to the private sector, both as an actor and subject of such regulations. And I think you showed very nicely how you strike this balance between reward and sanction mechanisms and the typical enforcement and compliance issues. Let me now turn to Vice Minister Sakaki. Same question for you. How do you engage with the private sector?
Yes, the effort to build the enabling environment in coordination with the stakeholders is essential to the step-by-step approach I mentioned previously. Japan has advanced capacity building programs, offering supporting tools for evaluation of building energy efficiency performance, as well as programs for raising awareness. Towards strengthening the energy efficiency standards next year, we've provided financial support such as subsidy programs to provide opportunities for businesses to learn about regulations and conducted over 100 information sessions nationwide. For further technical support, we've released the guidance to comply with the standards without complicated calculation. The calculation tools to enable the simpler evaluation of performance are also available. In addition, publications such as manga were released to raise awareness of necessities and benefits of the regulations. Through those approaches, energy efficiency performance of buildings, which are not covered by the mandatory standards, have been sufficiently enhanced to the level of the standards. And then we decided that the regulation were ready to expand its coverage to those buildings. For example, the mandatory regulations to residential buildings will be introduced in 2025, while the expected compliance rate has already increased from 46% in 2015 to over 80%. It suggests that our approach would successfully minimize the negative impacts on the economy. Now we are incorporating whole-life carbon approach to our policies. Our inclusive and holistic approach could also effectively work in this transition. Lastly, we believe our experience would be a useful lesson for other countries who intend to introduce regulations in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Vice Minister. A lot of emphasis on capacity building and awareness raising. I liked your point about mangas. I would never have thought that mangas could be used actually in this very technical area of building and decarbonization. Thank you so much. Over to Sonora and then C40, a brief point on private sector engagement.
Thank you. Yes, I just had told on my first participation, but we have a lot of communication with the private sector. We have a lot of education programs with the construction and the architects programs in the universities we have there in Sonora. We have also open doors regarding any consultant that would like to know what permits or other type of programs we have in the government of Sonora. We capacitate maybe 1,000 people a year in different topics, either climate change, buildings, energy efficiency, and as I told in my first participation, we work along on other organizations or associations that to make the message more easy for them to understand and for companies or the private sector to be interested regarding building, climate change, in other topics regarding ecology and environment. Yeah, thank you.
Great, thank you, Irene. And then I'll take a question or two, so just signal yourself if you wish to raise a question.
Yes, thank you. Very quickly, I think the city's convening power is one of the ones they use to engage with the private sector. So communicating and engaging stakeholders during the policy development process, because we do believe that you need to include the communities and the private sector while planning a new policy, in the policy itself, and inclusivity should also be embedded in the impacts. Who is going to benefit from this policy and how? Cities also have the power to introduce incentives, as we also heard from the national governments, and to facilitate the introduction of the policies they put in place. I have a few examples to reference, and one is actually from Mexico City, one of our member cities, that they introduced tax benefits to facilitate the reconversion of some buildings to a new use, so that they are not abandoned anymore, and a similar approach has Sao Paulo in Brazil used. We also have the empty homes tax in Vancouver, so actually you pay a tax if your asset is not being used and is not in the real estate market, so to avoid new construction. But also on the other end, on the retrofitting, Barcelona has introduced equitable energy efficiency retrofits to support low-income households to address the energy crisis in Europe and the cost crisis in Europe. Warsaw used the program to phase out coal boilers, which were deteriorating the indoor air quality and affecting, obviously, mostly vulnerable population. Paris has done the Eco-Renovon project that supported social housing and vulnerable housing retrofits. Many thousands of buildings have been retrofitted. When the final power cities has is on training and capacity building. There is this great example of Boston, which is called Power Corps Boston, which is a green industry workforce development program. And it's addressed to young people that have experienced homelessness or housing instability, to give them some additional training to be able to enter the green job industry.
Wonderful. Thank you, Irene. And I'm sure you can have access to the inspiring examples in C40's webpage. Probably you have a toolkit or a database somewhere where this can be collected. Don't see any hand up, so what I will suggest is that we give a big round of applause to the first panelists, that we stand up for a quick photo, if you agree, Minister, Vice Ministers, Irene, Sonora, and then we'll move to the second panel. Thank you. Picture. And Panu Pasanen, please come over here, have a seat. And we will now, with no further delay, and we're perfectly on time, move to the second panel of the session, which is devoted to stakeholders. So we spend a bit of time with governments from national, state, or local levels to understand the public policies, the public interventions in this area. We would like now to open the box to other stakeholders to illustrate that shared responsibility, and I'm really thrilled to welcome you all around this table. Thank you for your time and for being with us. We'll use the same rules of the game, 2 questions, 3-4 minutes each. I'll try to have us stick on time and finish on time. And I'd like to start with a first question that is about the type of regulation that is needed, according to you, stakeholders, to drive, accelerate this decarbonization agenda, and what you expect the governments to prioritize in developing such regulations. And if you have a view on whether what you've heard from governments in the previous panel goes in the same direction, or in the right direction, better said, or not, this is also a good moment to share your views. So short statements, 2-3 minutes, and then I'll have a second question for you, and we'll take questions from the audience if we can afford. And delighted to introduce first Tom Stewart from the International Code Council. If you can also explain a bit what the ICC is doing for those who may not be familiar, and target this question of what is needed and whether governments are prioritizing what is needed.
Sure, thank you. Thank you very much. You know, from the Code Council is a unique NGO in that we wholeheartedly embrace feedback from the public and the private sector, and so our experience derives from that, and our experience also is derived from working with governments throughout the world. You know, I took a lot of solace in the comments from the earlier panel about how they engaged the public and the private sector, and so it's our feeling that by engaging both the public and private sector to develop solutions, you get better outcomes. And the way the Code Council does that is by convening diverse groups of stakeholders from both public and private sector. So on the public side, engaging officials from the very highest level to the lowest level, the municipal level, and on the on the private sector side, likewise, engaging folks from the design community, the construction community, and the manufacturing community. So bringing all those stakeholders together to develop what we like to refer to as model codes and standards, which give governments a head start in implementing regulations that embrace the leading ideas from regulators and from the private sector.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. And I realize now this is Dominic Sims and not Tom Stewart, as my brief is saying, but same institution. At least I got that one right. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Indeed, that blended shared public-private responsibility and your convening power in this area. And let me now turn to Rana Adib from REN21, Executive Director, and if you can also explain what REN21 is and is doing.
Yeah, thank you so much. Okay, that's automatic, right? Perfect. Yes, I'm going to explain who we are because I think this will explain the angle of which I'm going to tackle this. REN21 is actually a multi-stakeholder community, government, industry, NGOs, science and academia, working on the uptake of renewable energy. And I think when we're speaking about the decarbonization of the building sector, very often we tend to look into reducing the energy demand, the material-based carbon. We look at energy efficiency, and renewables always comes a bit last. And I think what is really important, and that's the first message here, is this is not, we don't have the time to do this in a sequential way, and we need all solutions. So the regulations need to take into account all solutions. I think that's the first part, whether it's efficiency, renewables, the design part. The other aspect is that when we're looking basically at renewable energy, so we have a share in the building sector of renewable that is of only 23.5%. We'll need to move to 100%. That's basically the reality. So there's a long way. What we also see is that electricity, and you probably all know this much better, but is only 23.6% in the building sector. And I think this is something that is really important because we tend from the renewable side to look at the solutions, so the electricity solutions, solar PV and wind. But we have a massive amount of thermal use. And this requires that the building sector really also push the ambition of the renewable energy players to look beyond power. And I think that's really something we need your voice. So that's the first part, and we need the building sector voice in advancing the renewable energy regulations. And there is another aspect I would like to bring into this is when we speak about moving to renewables, it also means to speak about phasing out fossil fuel. So just some numbers, $7 trillion per year going into fossil fuel subsidies. This is 11 million per minute. And this also means that the regulations, so the money is there. It's not about the money. It's about shifting the money in the right solutions and shifting the money through regulations also in an equitable way. And here I'm going to just speak about some aspects which I think are important. We do see indeed in terms of policies and regulations from the renewable side, things happening. We have 20 countries that do have regulations on 21 countries, actually regulations on the building sector when we look from the renewable side. But we see that we only have 156 countries that have, or we have 156 countries that have solutions on electricity, renewable electricity, but only 26 on heating and cooling. Another aspect too, only 70 on the transport sector. And I think here is another aspect I would like to bring in to really increase the synergies between the building sector and the other sectors, between the different technologies, between efficiency, phasing out fossil fuel and renewable energy. We need to actually look not only at the building but at districts, because this is about infrastructure. Solutions can be local, but they are also infrastructure based. And a part of official or public buildings, I think there is also social housing that is really an opportunity to shift public money away from fossil fuel into equitable solutions that make the renewable energy solutions and energy efficiency solutions visible in the building sector. So also a lot of communication potential. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rana, and I liked your point about the need to go beyond the sequential approach that we can't afford. And actually what you're saying about phasing out fossil fuels is very consistent with the global survey finding, where we see that less than half of the countries surveyed actually have set very clear targets to phase out fossil fuels in heating and cooling strategies. So in this case, really some consistency across levels of government. Thank you, Rana, and let me now turn to Tina Payet. Tina from RICS, you have the floor.
Okay. So should I explain maybe a little bit about who RICS is? So RICS is a professional body with all the professions. We group a very wide range of professions within the built and natural environment. And we're also standard setters and regulators of those standards, alongside thought leadership and a number of other activities that we carry out for our 135,000 members in 142 countries. So I think this is a great opportunity, and I hadn't actually realized that this question was going to be asked. So I said, here I have a room full of ministers. And I can give you my wish list of what I would really like to see as RICS, what RICS would like to see in regulation. So the first, for me, and I think it's great because it's going to be very different from what you've just said. It's not that I disagree with the renewable energy. I fully agree. But I think for me, at RICS, our two main thrusts are going to be, is this working all right? Yeah. Our two main thrusts will be decarbonization through regulation of whole life carbon assessments. And it's really, really important that whole life carbon assessments get carried out on projects. And I really enjoyed also Japan minister's presentation about how you're going to be phasing in step by step those regulations on first energy efficiency and then carbon. It's very, very important. But whole life carbon touches on both the embodied carbon as well as the operational carbon. So that's a first regulation that we would really, really be calling for. And actually, we're not alone. There's a number of enterprises that have gotten together actually during this week, a roundtable CEO of manufacturers of materials who are also calling for whole life carbon standard assessments, as well as a number of other bodies. So this is a call from our sector to ministers that this is something that's really needed. If we want to decarbonize our industry, we need to do that, and we need to do it quickly. The second regulation that I would love to see is, and that I say I, but representing RICS, of course, that we would love to see would be a regulation, and we see very few of them, that would address the enormous issue we have with materials and their embodied carbon and the waste. So it's a circular economy regulation that we would like to see, because keeping in mind that over a third of waste streams across the world, global waste streams, are represented by construction and demolition waste. Keeping in mind that materials, resources, represent about 50% of usage of all materials that are excavated and mined from our soil, from our from our Earth, and so it's an incredible impact, as well as the carbon itself that represents our sector, and the materials represent between 10 and 11% of carbon of greenhouse gas emissions globally. So we have a huge impact. And if circular economy, if there were to be a portion of reused materials as well as recycled, but I say reused first, I think they need to be separate, to have a target for reused materials being deployed in new developments, we would come a long way to stopping the waste and to really, really create a much more material efficient sector. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tina. Very practical wish list, I have to say, on the whole life carbon assessment and embodied carbon related regulation. If we could afford the third panel with the governments back on stage, I would ask them what they'll do to go in this direction if they're not already on that path so far. Let me now turn to our last but not least panelist, Panu Pasanen, CEO of One Click LCA. Same question for you, and if you can also explain what One Click LCA is.
Yes, thank you. So my name is Panu Pasanen. I'm from One Click LCA, and One Click LCA provides whole life carbon software for buildings, infrastructure, and construction products. So we allow quantifying basically the carbon impact of anything that's done in the built environment. That's what we do. We also provide, we are a global training provider. We train in 7 languages. Pretty much anybody in the world can join our courses for free. And we are trying to help the industry to accelerate in decarbonization. So the regulatory wish list. First, in all economies, everybody understands that we have to stop fossil fuel use, right? Like there's nothing unclear about this. Industry knows it's coming. What is needed is to give certainty when is it coming, because then they can plan for their investment cycles. Then you know that I have to fix this building in 10 years, I have to fix this building in 12 years. How you do that? You set very clear regulatory deadlines for when you cannot anymore install any new fossil fuel-based boilers. Second, you set sunset replacement of existing ones in buildings. And third, you just actually take out of the tax code the right to sell fuels for those kind of boilers. So in Finland, in my country, we have, for example, fuel oil is illegal 29. So you cannot buy fuel oil. Nobody can sell it. You cannot buy it. Everybody has already stopped way ahead installing anything that would depend on fuel oil because they know it's obsolete investment. This gives industry predictability, and this is extremely desirable for job creation because this creates investments, and these investments create jobs, and these are high value added jobs. They are not importing fossil fuel type of job, which doesn't create jobs, it just creates imports. But these are creating local employment. That's the most important. Second most important, for all the more advanced economies, wherever you are, OECD members all, irrespective of global north or not, can do this, is to implement whole life carbon policies. Whole life carbon policies for new buildings and subsequently for renovations means that actually low carbon solutions have a market. You cannot have a successful market of low carbon innovation if there's no demand for those innovations. And that demand for those innovations is best created by performance. So you don't ask people to innovate, you ask them to do better. A bit like in sports, you ask them to run faster. So low carbon, run faster is measured by whole life carbon. And that creates a market for innovation, research and development investments, and that again creates jobs. And why it's important to do this locally is because obviously many of construction materials are very heavy, they cannot be transported, and you want to have a local economy producing those materials and potentially exporting them to other countries, so you are creating more employment. So those are the two first things. And the third thing, give a clear roadmap when you will act. Very inspiring example from Japan with great visibility on the years in which the code is going to be updated for the different types of buildings. And you should be very clear that we are moving to regulate this aspect. Then we are making disclosure mandatory on this year. We are making limit values mandatory in this year. And then industry will pick it up and they will start to upskill themselves and invest in solutions with this visibility that you're providing them.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Panu. Very clear wish list, some of which is echoing what was said on whole life carbon policies, but the roadmap and the anticipatory regulation point that you made is very spot on. Second question for all of you, and I'll go back to you, Dominique, and you can take a little bit more time to develop this time on how PPPs, public-private partnerships, could introduce and strengthen regulation, and how you can, with your respective institutions, also provide concrete assistance in this field in relation to your core mandate. So we'll start with ICC again.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. Thank you very much. You know, the Code Council developed its first model energy code in 1983. So we have been at it a while, and our experience, as I said earlier, is really shaped by this public-private partnership that we embrace. And you know, my sense is the reason it works so well is because it creates a consensus. And I think the most effective policies and regulations are those that have a degree of support from the private sector, because oftentimes it's the private sector that have to implement and comply with regulations. So, you know, we support the notion of you know, diversity of ideas and concepts, and taking the best ideas from the very local level and emphasizing them through a standard setting process. Because once we set them into a standard, it provides a pathway for manufacturers and the stakeholders engaged in the activity to have more predictability. So that's, I think, the important thing about the Code Council is achieving a consensus, embodying those consensus in a standard, and then taking those standards and using them to help governments achieve their goals. And then specifically on carbon, since, you know, that's the discussion for this week, the most important discussion. You know, our activity right now is focused a lot on how to count it effectively, because there's a growing need and demand to make sure what gets counted accurately and consistently. And so we're working with an organization called ASHRAE that supports the HVAC industry, and we're working with ASHRAE to develop a standard specifically on how to count carbon, operational carbon. And then our next project will be to figure out the most effective way and consistent way to count embodied carbon. And through these two projects, it's our hope that it'll give us a better sense of, one, how to predict a building's use of energy, and then also how to effectively design a building to minimize the embodied carbon.
Great. So accounting and standard setting to guide public action. Point
Yes.
taken. Panu?
Thank you. So if we look at the public-private partnerships, so they can obviously take many forms, excellent form of engaging the industry to coalesce around a standard. I would like to come back to the performance point of view, and the real estate and buildings industry has a particular problem because the ownership and the industry itself is extremely fragmented. So the investments in buildings, they are owned by financial institutions, but they are not active owners. They don't typically do that many things with them. So what would be a way to actually make the market move would be to look at the buildings pretty much in the same way as you look at solar auctions or wind power auctions. Many governments actually make power purchasing agreements based on who can supply it at the lowest cost. But the governments could actually give the financial opportunity to building owners to bid in an auction, basically for reducing their consumption, and that would mobilize those buildings that nobody actually invests in from an energy point of view, because they are not seeing themselves as the long-term owners and they don't see a clear business model. So we are actually in a market where many people own a building, or let's say financial institutions own buildings, but they don't bother to invest in them because they don't know how long they will be holding them for. So we would need to actually create a very competitive way to get that to improve, and an auction where the market competes for who can do the decarbonization the most effectively would be the best way to do that, and that could be done at a very large scale. Because these mechanisms, they are well understood and there's a big industry who is implementing them. This would allow to accelerate substantially, and I hope one of you walks away with this idea.
Thank you very much. Very good point on how to bridge those split incentives. Maybe I go back to you, Tina. You did mention CEOs and industry aligning with your wish list, or at least the first item of your wish list earlier. Anything you wish to add on the role of the private sector?
Absolutely. So the RICS is a membership organization, but also a standard setter and regulator. And one thing that we have been doing almost since our beginning 150 years ago, 155 years ago, is setting standards. And our first whole life carbon assessment standard came out in 2017. And a little over 2 years ago, we started updating that whole life carbon assessment standard, which we think is going to be key to be able to have a comparable and precise measurement so that we're measuring apples with apples. And that standard went out to consultation for a period of over 2 years. We got immense feedback from the entire stakeholder community, whether that be our membership or other professional bodies or, yet again, other stakeholders, governments, etc. So it's a widely consulted standard, which was published last year. And what we've done for this week is to prepare 4 documents, 4 guides that accompany the standard, so that the standard is easy to roll out, and very much almost a plug and play. So there's a client guide. There is a capacity building guide, and that's something I'll get back to. And there is also a harmonization guide, which is extremely important. Harmonization means that you may already have a carbon standard in some countries. It's not very widespread, as we saw from your colleague at OECD, but some countries do already have their standard, and that allows them to continue to use local standards, use the knowledge and the specificities of their local standard, but to bring it to a level that's comparable with other standards and other benchmarks. And that's really important because we have a global issue to tackle climate change. There are no frontiers. There are no borders. We need a global standard where we can measure and compare, and we can actually track our progress. So that harmonization guide can be really useful for countries either that want to develop their own whole life carbon assessment standard for their country, or that want to continue to use theirs, but to be able to bring it to a level where it's comparable. And I know I've used this before in an earlier panel, but I just want to say, to give an idea of how this standard that RICS has developed could actually be that overarching tool. It's similar to in the accountancy field, when you have local GAAP accountancy in parallel. And if you want to have a consolidated account for your enterprise, you have an overarching IFRS or other international standard. And this is really where RICS is a builder of international coalitions of standards, and we have a number of them that we do with all stakeholders across the board, is really well placed to have that overarching standard, which is what we are calling our whole life carbon assessment standard.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Tina. And for those of you who are not used or familiar with the standards, I suspect they can be accessed on the RICS webpage, right?
Yes,
Probably.
absolutely.
Excellent.
Absolutely.
And we conclude with Rana. Back to you.
Okay, thank you.
And then if anyone wishes to ask a question or share experience or add an example. We're slightly ahead of schedule. If you stick to the 2 minutes, we should have 2, 3 for an intervention or 2 from the floor before wrapping up.
Okay, so I'll speak super quickly. No, I'll build. I would like to build on the solar PV auctions part because I think there is a learning to share. I would completely echo what you're saying. Do auctions in the building part. I think this makes a lot of sense. What we are learning from the renewable side on these auctions is that they have focused on least cost, which is really important to create the market, obviously. But they have not looked at highest value. And I think when we're speaking about value, we need to look at the societal values, we need to look at the environmental values, and that's something that also has a price, I guess. So my recommendation would be to include this, especially as when we're looking, and I think public-private is really important here, but the objective is serving basically society, right? And this means increasing and ensuring societal support. Here we clearly see that we need policy support, that's one part. We need the private sector support, whether it's sectoral or whether it is a finance sector, that's one part. But we also need to have citizen support. And I think one key here is that governments and the public-private, we need to ensure that the citizens and civil society have a seat around the table from the beginning on, because otherwise they might actually not accept the solutions. That's one part. In terms of values, I think we need to acknowledge the fact that, especially in OECD countries, we look very much at decarbonization of the building sector. But when we're looking in developing countries, this is actually about economic development. It's about access to housing. It is about access to quality housing. It is about access to energy. It is about load shedding. And there is a major economic implication here. And I think that's really something which in the public-private aspect is to point out, because very often what we're doing in the building sector or in the energy sector is actually not the main driver. Climate is not the main driver. There are other drivers. And I think this is something to take into account, because we need to develop the public-private entry points, not only from the environmental and the housing perspective. And building on this, finishing with one short example, because I think it's quite an interesting example. In the housing sector, very often we speak about also in renewable energy, capital costs are very high. How do we have access to finance? Can we ask citizens to pay? How do we create the markets? And here Octopus Energy with real estate partners have actually developed a really interesting, this is now for new buildings, but I think can be interesting, integrating efficiency and renewable energy into the housing part through the loans for access to the housing. And I think this is something where there is a major economic market, which is the financial market for housing, real estate, where you can regulate, we can regulate by public-private collaboration here, and include renewable energy and energy efficiency solutions and standards in the public loans, because many governments do have policies to support access to housing through subsidized loans.
Thank you very much. So this is a last call. If there's anyone from the audience. Yes, sir, if you can please introduce yourself. If it's a question to someone in particular, target the right person. If not, go ahead.
If you can allow so. So my name is Thomas from Germany. I am a researcher, but also consultant. I'm representing here also ISPE, the International Initiative for Sustainable Built Environment, organizing a world conference in June. So I like to support, first of all, the wish list from Tina. I also like to see whole life carbon assessment. But I like to contribute how we can come to reality from such a wish list. And from my point of view, we need something like a shopping list as a next stage. So there was a lot about regulation, but also standardization and harmonization. So for sure, to make this real, and our dream is here in this room, to achieve legal binding requirements to limit greenhouse gas emissions in the life cycle of a building. This is our target. So what do we need in our shopping list? So we need the calculation rules and the assessment rules. Here are the standard makers, both of you, but do not forget there are more, like ISO, like CEN, like others. So now we have a lot of different, let us say, calculation and assessment rules already. Next, we need benchmarks. There are so many zeros around the world. Net zero, absolute zero, nearly zero, close to zero, zero ready, something like this, yes? Different zeros. But we need a very clear benchmark. What does it mean? So figures are not enough. We need in the background the calculation and assessment rules and very clear system boundaries. Next, we need data. It was nice to learn from you. You are in contact with leading persons from construction product industry. So please invite such persons not to come out with beautiful statements, but with good data, environmental product declarations describing the data. And we need the data and the decarbonization strategies. So what is your data in 2030 from now? We need good software. So Panu is representing also here the software. We need good software. And we have to train the experts to do so, because somebody must do the calculation. So to make this real regulation, you need the full package. And this is also experience, and we can share such experience from Germany. We are doing so in this direction. And if you like, we can tell you more about this next time. Thank you.
Thank you. It looks almost like you were hired to do the conclusion. This was an amazing connection of the different interventions. Thank you very much. Thank you all for your time. And Dominique, Tina, Panu, Rana, and maybe we stand up for a picture and then everybody can come and solicit you for more. Good? Maybe get closer here. Okay, here we are. Good? Thank you. Merci beaucoup. Safe trip.